Israeli intelligence, I was always told, was one of the best in the world. Well, how did they miss something that was in the planning for 2 years? When you have 3,000 militants coming across from Gaza, how do you not respond?
Could you use a word to define 2023?
If I had to choose one word to define 2023, the word would be challenging. I think it was a challenging year for everyone on the professional front, on the international front, and for many of us on the personal front as well. So it's goodbye to 2023 with the word challenging. I would choose the word challenging because I think that firstly, in terms of the international front, we're witnessing so many events that are happening in the news world, whether it is the war between Hamas and Israel, which is ongoing, whether it's the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is ongoing, whether it's an earthquake that happened last year in Turkey that still sees millions of people displaced. I think the challenges posed on a humanitarian level, a political level, are immense. And I sometimes wonder whether it's because there are more challenges than there were in previous years, or whether we have just become more interconnected as a global community because of social media, because of television, because of technology, that we know more about what's happening in other parts of the world. Whatever the reason, it just feels that we are inundated too often with bad news. I mean, of course, there's some good news, but I would choose the word challenging because I find that not one day goes past without there being some kind of tragedy somewhere in the world. I also choose the word challenging on a personal level because 2023 for me was the year that after 18 years, I left RT, Russia Today, and I'm setting up my own television channel, which is BGTN, which is due to go live 24/7 in the coming months. And so it's been very challenging doing that, going from working for a television company for nearly 2 decades to suddenly taking that experience and setting up a channel oneself. And I always wanted to be a correspondent that covered war. I don't know why. Probably something wrong with my psychology. And I joined RT just under 20 years ago with the position of their Middle East Bureau. And it was exciting. RT had just started up. It was 2006. It was actually the end of 2005. And within months, I was covering all the conflicts across the Middle East. And I choose the word challenging because there are always conflicts. So whether it was Lebanon, Israel, whether it was Gaza, whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it, I covered those conflicts for RT. 2 decades on, I'm a little bit tired of conflict. And I also think social media has changed the way we report. And I'm not convinced that it's still so important for journalists to be the first at a story. In fact, I don't even think we can be. I think social media means that journalists will always get there a few hours later or perhaps a day later. And so I think our role is changing more to verification, looking at the news, contextualizing it. And so the role of the war reporter is also changing. It's not about being the first on the story. It's not about being the only one at the story either. And as those changes happen, I find that I'm a bit tired of the war reporting. 2 decades on, and I would like a new challenge. And what a fantastic challenge to be in a position that you can set up your own channel.
Who is the most memorable figure in 2023?
The most memorable figure for me from 2023 and also going forward would have to be the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. I think that this man is remarkable in terms of what he's doing. First of all, last year, with China, of course, brokering the agreement, but he was instrumental in bringing together Saudi and Iran to sign a peace deal. Now, this was something I've covered Middle East politics for the last 2 decades. If you had told me this was going to happen, I would have said absolutely no. These are the two polar opposites. You have Iran, which is Shia, you have Saudi, which is Sunni. When I was reporting in Israel, what a lot of Israelis were afraid of was that Iran was going to use their nuclear power against them. And then the experts were saying, but first Iran will use their nuclear power against Saudi. And now you've got the Saudis and the Iranians signing a peace deal. So for me, that was remarkable. And that happened last year. At the same time, we see the conflict between Hamas and Israel. From what we understand, the Saudi prince was on the verge, or at least was having meetings to create a peace deal between Israel and Saudi. And Saudi's the leader of particularly the Arab Sunni world. If Israel had signed that deal with Saudi, we would not have the situation we have now. And you would have actually had the unbelievable situation of Israel being in a peace. It might not be a peace deal that's cheerful and admirable on all levels, but at least on paper, it would have been a peace deal between Israel and the Arab world. And we still hear now some mention from the Saudi government that when the war, please God, when the war between Israel and Hamas is over, they are still interested in normalizing relations with Israel. Whether that happens is another story. But I think that's all because of the Saudi crown prince. And I think, especially as a young man, I think he's 38, it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that, to sign a peace deal with Israel, something that would have been unheard of until then. The other things that he's doing, he has the Saudi 2030 vision, where he is going to turn Saudi into something that it's never been in the past. He wants to take the country's reliance away from oil and invest it in numerous projects. So you'll have the city of the future, which is known as NEOM. You already have all these sports talents. For example, Cristiano Ronaldo going to live in Saudi and play for Saudi sides. And for me, this is a leader that the West wants to talk to, the East wants to talk to, everybody wants to talk to him. And it's not just because he has money. From what I understand, Saudi has enough oil money for the next 200, and I think the figure was the next 220 years, plus minus. But I think he is a man who's not afraid of making decisions. And for me, he would be someone to watch going forward as well. I feel that he is, if not the most influential, then definitely one of a handful of the most influential leaders on the world stage. And what I think is also exciting is that so few people know anything about Saudi. I haven't been there, and I'm actually planning to go there this year. And I think that I sense Saudi Arabia is going to become the new United Arab Emirates, in the sense that the capital of Saudi, Riyadh, will be Dubai. 30 years ago, Dubai was something new. It was in the desert, and they were attracting foreigners, and let's build Dubai. I think this is what is going to happen with Riyadh. They are looking for foreigners to come. If you go on any advertising for jobs in Saudi, they're prepared to pay money. They want to pay for talent. They want to pay people who know what they're doing, and they're not afraid of bringing in foreigners, building up the country. Of course, one of the challenges facing the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is going to be finding the right balance with the religious parties, because he needs to deal with those that are very religious in his country. And they're not going to want to have Riyadh as a tourist center for Western foreigners like Dubai is. So I think he has a lot of pressure and challenges, and that's why I really admire him, because I think Saudi Arabia is going to become the new United Arab Emirates, the new Dubai. And for people like me, actually, who feel that I missed out on Dubai 30 years ago, I would be open to going to Riyadh now, 30 years later, and saying, well, let's see what opportunities are here. Let's see how this country is making the desert bloom, because that's what they're doing. One of the projects is what is called rewilding. 100 years ago, Saudi Arabia had animals and jungles that you see here in Africa, and now it's a desert. And so one of the projects and one of the stories that we've been looking at is how they are rewilding the Saudi desert, how they're introducing animals there, and how they're dealing with the climate changes that made it into a desert to actually bring back the fauna and flora of 100 years ago.
What are some of the most significant stories shaping 2023?
So my focus at the moment with this channel that I'm launching, BGTN, BRICS Global Television Network, of course, is BRICS. One of the big issues of 2023 was, of course, the BRICS Summit that was held here in Johannesburg, South Africa, where I'm talking to you from, in August, the 22nd to the 24th of August. And as you well know, next year it will be held in Russia. So what is happening in the BRICS world and what comes out of these summits, for me, is a big tick in terms of what I focused on in 2023. One of the issues here was the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, whether he was going to come to the BRICS summit or not. And there was a whole lot of delays. In fact, before the summit, we didn't even get, as journalists, the program for the summit up until a few days before it began. And a lot of that was confusion about, there was talk at one stage that they were actually going to move it to China, and then they were going to keep it in South Africa. And was Putin coming? Wasn't Putin coming? Be that as it may, the countries that are part of BRICS were here. 6 other countries were invited, and only 5 of those joined officially in January. Argentina declined the invitation. So you now have members of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then you have 5 new countries, which are Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Going forward, you've got something like 14 countries that have formally requested to join, and you've got more than 20 who have expressed that they're interested. So for me, one of the stories is BRICS. I think it's going to be interesting also going forward how BRICS is going to challenge the American dollar, what it means on an economic front. It's definitely a story that I highlighted on and was focused on in 2023. The second story for me would be the 7th of October. I'm thinking of the right word, war, because it was later declared a war between Hamas and Israel. And that is now in its more than 90 days. And that, of course, was when you had something like 3,000 Hamas militants who crossed over the Israel-Gaza border. You had something like 5,000 rockets fired at Israel in a surprise attack. There are still questions being asked why Israel wasn't actually ready for that attack. I was based in Israel for Russia Today before coming here to South Africa. So I do have some insight in terms of what's going on there. And one of the questions is, how did Israeli intelligence fail to the extent that it did? And the only answer, if it's interesting for you, that I can share with you is what I get from Israelis that I speak to is that right now they're in a state of war and they don't want to ask those questions. They will ask the questions, but they're trying to deal with the situation as is and then go backwards and see what went wrong. I think this war has opened up to Israel the shortcomings of its own defense, the shortcomings of the Israeli Defense Forces. We are hearing from the Israeli President Netanyahu that they're going to clean out Gaza. But you have, I looked at the figures of Palestinians killed, 23,000 Palestinians killed, of which the majority are women, 17,000. Of course, you've got high figures on the Israeli side, and it's not fair to compare figures because one life is a life. But I think this conflict, and this is what's concerning, has the ability to turn into World War III. If Iran gets involved, with the United States being involved, it is not just about Israel and Hamas, which also begs the question whether it was just about Israel and Hamas in the beginning. And there's a lot of thought, and I would be one of those people who would say, I suspect, whether it was Iran, Russia, America, there are the bigger powers at play. And Israel and Hamas in this war, I think, are their pawns. Okay. And the sad thing is that in the meantime, you have Palestinians and Israelis who've been killed, and those numbers are going to continue. Another big story for me from 2023, of course, coming from having worked with RT, Russia Today, was the killing of the Wagner boss. Now, Wagner, of course, is the Russian private military company, Evgeny Prigozhin, and he was one of 10 people who died in a helicopter crash. I was very involved in that story, and there was a lot of speculation in the beginning as to whether or not he had died, whether or not it was just a cover-up. The reason why it was important to me, of course, was because he had led a kind of rebellion against the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. It was a short-lived rebellion back in June last year, and then it just kind of simmered. There were a few hours when all of us working and following Russian news were in a state of shock, thinking that, could this possibly be an overthrow of President Putin? And then almost as soon as it started, it stopped. And the understanding is that he was paid something like $2 billion. There's still a lot of questions around that as to, was this actually an accident when the plane went down? Was it something more sinister? What actually happened, and if it was something more sinister, who was behind it? For me, that was one of the interesting stories to come out of 2023. Another interesting story for me would be the Russia-Ukraine war, which I reported on extensively when it began back in 2014. And this is almost the second chapter now that we're witnessing in 2023. I think that what's happening with Israel and Hamas, this war is now on the back pages. which is always unfortunate. I think it has the potential to become a frozen conflict, meaning that it will continue and continue. And unfortunately, us as journalists, one of the things we do badly is we forget stories and then we come back to them. And I think this is a story that will continue. And how much attention it gets is just going to be how much attention journalists see fit to give it. I mean, it's already a bit of an old story, and there are so many missing people. That's a story I've covered, something of thousands of children who've gone missing from Ukraine, not into Russia, into Western Europe and the rest of the world. And perhaps just a fifth and final story that for me was significant last year was the Turkey earthquake. That was back in February, and the figures are about 50,000 people who were killed, some 15 million people, if not more, who were affected, and 107,000 people injured. That earthquake, of course, happening in the south of Turkey and the north of Syria. And millions of dollars have been spent and are still being spent trying to provide humanitarian assistance to the victims of the Turkey earthquake.
Is Israel's failure an excuse or possibility?
That's a really good question, because you're asking me whether Israel's failure is an excuse or possibility. I would have answered that question in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack and say it was an excuse. Like the Israeli army, there's no way that they did not get the information. And there's some reports that I saw of hours that it took the Israeli soldiers to respond. You had people on social media that were uploading and saying, please, I'm hiding in my bunker or in whatever part of their house there was, please come help me. And it was only hours later that they were either rescued or militants came in and killed them. So the question is, what happened in those hours? My initial response would have been, that's impossible. The Israeli army, is supposedly one of the best in the world, very well prepared. It is obviously just not possible. In the weeks since then, I would change my answer. And I would say that it is now a probability and not necessarily an excuse. I think what we've seen in the last 90 days since the war started is, unfortunately for the Israelis, that their army is not as sophisticated and not as prepared as many people, including or especially the Israeli civilian population, would like to think. I think once this war, please God, is over and it doesn't become a third world war, there'll have to be a lot of responsibility being handed out in Israel in terms of why this happened and why the army was so ill prepared. There's a report I saw today saying that Hamas had already planned this back in 2021. Israeli intelligence, I was always told, was one of the best in the world. Well, how did they miss something that was in the planning for 2 years? When you have 3,000 militants coming across from Gaza, how do you not respond? The size of Israel is the size of the Kruger National Park in South Africa. It is 1/15 the size of South Africa. And I've spoken to people here in South Africa who are commandos who say that when they are on call, they can go anywhere in South Africa within 2 hours. How is it possible that in a country like South Africa, in a country like Israel, that's 1/15 the size of this, it took them 6 to 8 hours to respond. So I think there's going to be a lot of inner searching, a lot of changes that will need to be made in Israel.
How does South Africa view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
This Israeli-Palestinian conflict has really brought to the fore. Let me start that differently. South Africa has a very sizable Muslim population, and most of the Muslims in South Africa side with the Palestinians. In fact, South Africa at the moment has taken Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice for genocide charges. And the South Africans who support that and who support the Palestinians often argue that because of South Africa's history of apartheid, which was segregating people, they often say that what's happening in Israel is the same. Now, South Africa has a much smaller Jewish community that by and large supports Israel. And they're constantly pointing out the differences between what happened in South Africa and what happened in Israel. But the truth is that I really get the sense neither side is going to convince the other. And all that happens whenever you have a war in Israel is that those who support the Palestinians will start holding demonstrations and lobbying the government, and those who support Israel will do what they want to do. Nobody's opinions here change. The majority of South Africans would be your Christian, let's say Black Christian South Africans. There's a big part of them that actually support Israel. They see Israel in Bible terms. These would be whether evangelical Christians or other types of Christians. They do believe that the Jews are the chosen people, that Israel is the chosen country, but they're not the most vocal. If you had to walk the streets of South Africa, or if you had to open a newspaper now, the most dominant voice that's coming across, which doesn't necessarily mean it represents the majority, but the ones who are the most vocal are those who support the Palestinians and are against Israel. And the government of South Africa has taken a stand to be much more pro-Palestinian. In fact, over the last few years, they have downgraded the South African embassy in Israel. I stand to be corrected, but as far as I know, there is not a South African ambassador in Israel, and I'm not sure if there's an Israeli ambassador in South Africa. They have really brought the relationship between the two countries all the way down. That also dates back to the time of apartheid South Africa, and during those years, South Africa had dealings with Israel, particularly around nuclear arms. Now, the Israelis will say, well, we were a new country and we were looking for friends, and South Africa offered itself as a friend. The critics will say, but South Africa was an apartheid country and you shouldn't have had dealings with an apartheid country. Like everywhere in the world, this Israeli-Hamas conflict touches on emotions for people. And so what we have seen in South Africa is demonstrations at different retail stores that support Israel, or if the owner is a pro-Israel activist, and people will protest with Palestinian flags in front of it. South Africans feel very strongly about this, particularly on an emotional level.
How the world would be like in 2024?
The word I chose for 2023 was challenging. And if you ask me the word I would choose for 2024, can I cheat and say more challenging? 2 words. There's something like 20 elections coming up. One of them is here in South Africa. It's an important year for South Africa and the elections, because South Africa is now, this year, 2024 will be 30 years since the start of democracy. On the one hand, it's exciting because obviously there's been a lot of improvement. On the other hand, it's a bit disheartening because there are so many things that people perhaps had wished for 30 years ago that haven't come true. So it's also challenging being back in South Africa. I come back to a media sphere that I haven't been involved in for 20 years, and to a country that I recognize in some ways and don't recognize in other ways. It's 30 years since the fall of apartheid, the new South African government, Nelson Mandela walking out of prison. And so there'll be a lot of retrospective thinking. How far has this country come? It is also 30 years since the Rwanda genocide. Rwanda's not far from South Africa. And when everybody around the world was celebrating South Africa's freedom, one of the sad things that journalists ignored when we were all focused here was that not far from here, there was a terrible genocide happening where almost a million Hutus were killed. So that's 30 years since the Rwanda genocide, and perhaps the lessons we've learned or haven't learned from there. I think we will continue with the war between Russia and Ukraine. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, is a frozen conflict. And I think that could continue for quite some time. I think the war between Russia and Ukraine will continue. I think that is a frozen conflict, and I think it will remain frozen probably for years to come. And I think that has an impact on what's happening between Israel and Hamas, because I think the United States has been very quick to say it supports Israel, but militarily it can offer less than it could have before it got involved in Ukraine. And I think the US has given a lot to Ukraine that could potentially have been given to Israel. I don't know if it's significant enough to change the course of America's assistance to Israel, but I do think it's worthy to note. I think 2024, for me, the most significant story of 2024 will be this war, will be the Israel-Hamas, and whether or not it escalates into World War III. Because if it escalates, you have Iran backing Hamas, and Russia's on the same side. You have the United States backing Israel, and you have all the criteria of what could potentially become a third world war. I think China is in an interesting position. I think particularly because China brokered the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was kept under wraps. No one knew it was happening until the announcement came. I think China is an interesting player to watch. And I think many people outside of China, and certainly in the circles I move, feel that China is actually the real power globally. And it'll be interesting to see what the Chinese president does. And he might be the person that has the ability to sway the direction of which some world politics will be heading off. I think 2023 will continue to see the rise of Saudi Arabia. I think we will see Saudi flexing its muscles, whether it's in terms of business or not, elsewhere on the global stage. And here in Africa, what is also a big story is the growing influence of China in Africa. And I have been traveling Africa quite a lot over the last few months since I came back. And there is distinctly, but it's been going on for a while, very strong influence in Africa by China. People feel it. Depending which country you're in, people either welcome it or don't welcome it. But I think that will certainly continue to grow with 2024.